The morning sun hadn't quite crested the skyline yet, but inside the glass and steel tower of Viridian Holdings, the day was already in full swing. Fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead, casting a clean, almost sterile glow over the polished marble floors and sleek reception desk. People in sharp suits moved with purpose, some clutching coffee cups, others tapping furiously on phones, all radiating the kind of urgency that comes with high stakes and higher expectations. At the center of it all was Daniel Reeves, new CEO, 42 years old, hand-picked by the board after a string of impressive turnarounds at other firms. He walked with his shoulders back and his chin slightly raised, not out of arrogance, he told himself, but because he believed in the weight of his role. Today was only his third week on the job, and already the pressure was mounting. Profits were flat. Shareholders were restless. And the board had made it clear they wanted results fast. As he strode down the east corridor toward his office, Daniel scanned the space like a general surveying a battlefield. Every detail mattered. The arrangement of chairs in the waiting area, the speed of the elevators, even the way the potted ferns were trimmed. Efficiency, he believed, started with discipline. And discipline started at the top. But also, he thought, trickled down to the very bottom. That's when he saw him. Near a service closet sitting on a low bench tucked beside a potted palm was an older black man in a faded blue uniform. His mop bucket sat nearby, water still rippling from recent use. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't chatting with anyone. He was just sitting, eyes closed, breathing slowly. One hand rested on his knee, the other loosely holding a worn thermos. Daniel stopped. To him, this wasn't rest. It was slacking. In his previous roles, he'd cut entire departments for less. If you're on the clock, you're on your feet, he used to say. And here, in his own building on his watch, someone was taking a break during peak morning hours. He walked over, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. "Excuse me," he said, voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the HVAC system. The man opened his eyes slowly. They were calm, deep brown, steady, and surprisingly alert. He didn't look startled, didn't scramble to stand, just looked up at Daniel with a quiet kind of patience, like he'd seen this moment coming long before it arrived. "This is a work area," Daniel continued, gesturing vaguely toward the empty hallway. "Not a lounge. If you're on shift, you should be working." The man set his thermos down gently. "I was," he said simply. "Finished the East Wing 20 minutes ago. My next assignment starts at 9. I've got 10 minutes left on my scheduled break." Daniel frowned. He hadn't checked the cleaning schedule. Didn't know it existed, honestly. But admitting that would mean backing down. And he wasn't about to do that in front of the two junior analysts who'd just rounded the corner and were now watching with wide eyes. "Scheduled or not," Daniel said, voice dropping lower but growing tighter, "you don't sit in high traffic zones looking like you're napping. It sends the wrong message. This is a professional environment." The man stood slowly, not out of fear, but with a kind of dignity that made Daniel pause, just for a second. He was taller than he looked sitting down. His uniform was clean, though worn at the elbows. His name tag read A. Langley. "I meant no disrespect," Langley said. "Just catching my breath. I'm 73 years old. Some days, that's all it takes." For a split second, something in Daniel wavered. But then he remembered the board's email from last night. "We need leaner operations. No exceptions." He straightened his tie. "Well, today's your last day," Daniel said, trying to sound firm, not cruel. "We can't have employees setting a poor example. HR will process your final check." Langley didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He just nodded once, slow, deliberate, and picked up his bucket. He looked around the hallway one last time, as if memorizing the light, the air, the feel of the place. Then he walked away, his steps quiet but steady. The two analysts exchanged glances but said nothing. One of them looked down at her shoes. Back in his corner office, Daniel poured himself a glass of water and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his chest. He told himself he'd done the right thing. Tough decisions were part of leadership. Still, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Langley had looked at him, not with anger but with something closer to disappointment. Like he'd expected better. Downstairs, Langley handed his keys and ID badge to the night supervisor, who stared at him in shock. "They fired you?" she whispered. "They did," he said, offering a small, tired smile. But don't worry about me." He walked out through the employee entrance past the loading docks and into the cool morning air. The city buzzed around him, honking cabs, delivery bikes weaving through traffic, people rushing to their own important meetings. He paused at the curb, took a deep breath, and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number saved under legal trust. "It's done," he said when the call connected.
"He dismissed me this morning."
In front of witnesses. Recorded it just like we discussed. A pause. Then a voice on the other end. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Langley looked back at the towering building behind him, its windows glinting like eyes in the sun. "I've never been more sure," he said. "It's time they remember who this company really belongs to." He ended the call, tucked the phone into his pocket, and started walking. Not toward a bus stop or a subway station, but toward a quiet cafe 3 blocks away. One where he'd been coming for years, long before he ever owned a single share of Viridian Holdings. Inside the building, no one knew what was coming. The analysts returned to their desks, uneasy but silent. The receptionist avoided eye contact with the cleaning crew, and Daniel Reeves sat in his office reviewing spreadsheets, unaware that the man he'd just fired held more power in his quiet hands than Daniel had ever dreamed of wielding. But that truth, it would surface soon enough. For now, the building kept humming, polished, efficient, and utterly blind to the storm, quietly gathering just beyond its gleaming doors. Most people who met Arthur Langley for the first time assumed he'd lived a quiet life. The kind that left little trace, steady paycheck, modest home, maybe a garden in the backyard. And in a way, they weren't entirely wrong. He had lived quietly, but not because he had to, because he chose to. Long before Viridian Holdings became a name on the stock exchange, Arthur was already deep in the world of finance, not as a flashy trader shouting on a floor, but as a quiet strategist who preferred reading balance sheets over attending galas. He started in the 1970s, working nights at a post office while studying accounting at a community college. He never complained about the double shifts. To him, exhaustion was just part of the climb. By the 80s, he'd earned a reputation for spotting value where others saw risk. He invested early in tech startups no one believed in. He bought undervalued real estate in neighborhoods others had written off. And he never borrowed more than he could pay back in a year. "Money's a tool," he'd say, "not a trophy." His wife, Evelyn, used to laugh at how he'd come home from meetings in $1,000 suits but still patch his own socks. She passed 10 years ago, and since then, Arthur had kept mostly to himself, except for his work, which never really stopped. Even after officially retiring at 68, he stayed involved through a private trust he'd set up decades earlier. It held his shares in a handful of companies, including one he'd quietly acquired a controlling stake in during a market dip 5 years back. Viridian Holdings. He didn't buy it for the prestige. He bought it because he believed in what the company could be. Not just a profit machine, but a place where people felt seen, respected, and valued, no matter their title. But over the years, as leadership changed hands, that vision had faded. Reports from inside grew colder, morale slipping, turnover rising, decisions made in boardrooms with no regard for the folks on the ground. So Arthur did something unusual, even by his own standards. He applied for a job, not as a consultant, not as an advisor, but as a janitor. The hiring manager nearly laughed when the 72-year-old walked in with a clean resume and calm eyes. "You sure about this, sir?" he'd asked. "I'm sure," Arthur replied. "I like to keep busy, and I've always believed you learn more from mopping floors than from sitting in leather chairs." They gave him the job, partly out of pity, partly because they were short-staffed. No one checked his background too closely. Why would they? He wasn't applying for CFO. He just wanted a broom and a schedule. For the next 8 months, Arthur showed up before sunrise, 5 days a week. He cleaned restrooms, wiped down conference tables, emptied trash bins, and polished windows. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed who held the door for the cleaning crew and who acted like they were invisible. He saw which managers stayed late to help their teams and which ones dumped last-minute work and vanished at 5 sharp. He also noticed how people treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. One afternoon, he overheard a young intern apologize to a security guard for spilling coffee near the elevator. "No worries," the guard said, smiling. "Happens to the best of us." Later that same day, a senior executive barked at the same guard for standing too close to the executive lounge. Arthur filed those moments away, not in a notebook but in his heart. He wasn't there to spy. He was there to understand, and what he found troubled him. The company had become efficient, yes, but at the cost of humanity. Emails were cold. Meetings were rushed. Kindness was seen as weakness. And somewhere along the way, respect had been replaced by hierarchy. Still, he held out hope. Maybe the new CEO would be different. The board had talked about wanting fresh energy, modern leadership. Arthur wanted to believe that meant empathy, not just spreadsheets. But then came Daniel Reeves. From day one, Arthur watched him. Saw how he nodded politely in all-hands meetings but cut people off in smaller gatherings. Noticed how he praised lean operations while ignoring the stress in employees' voices. And then, that morning, when Daniel saw him resting and saw not a man who'd worked since dawn, but a problem to be removed, it all clicked. This wasn't just about one harsh moment. It was about a pattern, a culture. And Arthur knew with quiet certainty that if he didn't act now, the soul of the company would vanish completely. What no one knew, not Daniel, not HR, not even the board, was that every share Arthur owned was held through a blind trust with ironclad privacy protections. Public filings listed only a shell entity. To the outside world, Viridian's ownership looked diffuse, corporate, faceless. But in reality, one man held over 51% of voting control, and that man had just been fired for taking a 10-minute break. Back at his small apartment that evening, modest, tidy, filled with books and photos of Evelyn, Arthur sat at his kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea. On his laptop, he pulled up the trust's legal documents. Everything was in order. The emergency clause was clear. If the trust's representative deemed leadership a threat to company values, they could call a special board meeting with 48 hours' notice. He'd never used it before, but today felt like the right time. He typed a short email to the firm's lead counsel, attached the audio file from his pocket recorder, the one that captured every word in the hallway that morning. Then he added a single line, "Schedule the meeting. It's time." As he hit send, he thought about the janitor uniform hanging in his closet. He'd missed the rhythm of the work, the quiet hum of the vacuum, the smell of lemon cleaner, the way the building felt peaceful before sunrise. But he wasn't doing this for revenge. He was doing it because someone had to remind them that a company isn't just numbers on a screen. It's people, real people, with tired feet and full hearts and stories no org chart can capture. Later that night, he walked to the park near his building, sat on his favorite bench under an old oak tree, watched a group of kids chase fireflies as their parents laughed nearby. He smiled. This was the world he wanted Viridian to serve, not just shareholders but families, not just profits but purpose. Tomorrow the board would get the notice. Tomorrow everything would begin to shift. But tonight? Tonight Arthur Langley just breathed, and for the first time in months he felt at peace. The days after Arthur Langley walked out of Viridian Holdings felt off, not in a way anyone could easily explain, but in the quiet spaces between conversations, in the way people avoided eye contact in the hallways, in the sudden drop in chatter around the coffee machine. It was as if the building itself had taken a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Daniel Reeves didn't notice at first. He was too busy. Spreadsheets stacked up on his desk like unread novels. Conference calls bled into lunch hours. He'd launched what he called Operation Streamline, a series of aggressive cost-cutting measures designed to boost short-term performance. Outsourcing the mailroom, eliminating free snacks in break rooms. If they want chips, let them bring their own. Replacing 3 mid-level managers with 1 overworked director. Each decision came with a tidy justification: efficiency, agility, market competitiveness. But with every email he sent, something else slipped away: trust. People started leaving work exactly at 5 p.m., no matter how unfinished their tasks were. The usual Friday afternoon team huddles went silent. Even the receptionist, who used to greet everyone with a warm good morning, now just nodded stiffly. No one said anything outright. No one filed complaints, but the air grew heavier, like a storm building behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Daniel remained convinced he was doing the right thing. He told himself discomfort was part of change, that real leaders made hard calls, even when they weren't popular. He even mentioned Arthur's dismissal in a leadership meeting as an example of holding everyone accountable no matter their role. The room fell quiet. One manager cleared her throat and stared at her notebook. Then, on a Tuesday morning, just 5 days after Arthur's last shift, an email landed in Daniel's inbox with the subject line, "Urgent, special board meeting, 48-hour notice." He frowned. Special meetings weren't common, and 48-hour notice meant something serious was happening, usually a merger, a scandal, or a major investor move. He clicked it open. The message was brief, formal, signed by the corporate secretary. A major shareholder, holding a controlling interest, had invoked an emergency clause in the company bylaws and demanded an immediate board convening. All directors were required to attend, in person or via secure video. The agenda? Review of executive leadership and company culture. Daniel's stomach tightened. Controlling interest? That didn't make sense. Viridian's ownership was spread across institutional investors, mutual funds, a few private equity firms. No single entity held more than 12%. At least that's what the public filings showed. He called his chief of staff. "Who's behind this?" he asked. "We don't know yet," she replied, voice tense. "Legal's digging. But the shares are held through a trust. Cedar Hollow Holdings. It's been on the books for years, but always voted with management." "Never caused a stir. Then why now?" Daniel muttered. No one had an answer. Over the next 2 days, rumors swirled. Was it an activist investor? A hostile takeover attempt? Someone upset about the layoffs? People whispered in corners, exchanged nervous glances in elevators. Some hoped it was a chance for change. Others feared more cuts. What no one guessed, what no one could have guessed, was that the man they'd watched mop floors just a week ago was the one pulling the strings. Arthur, meanwhile, stayed out of sight. He spent his mornings reading, tending to his small balcony garden and taking long walks through the neighborhood. He didn't check the news, didn't scroll through company message boards. He'd done what he needed to do. Now it was up to others to respond. But inside Viridian, tension climbed like a fever. On the eve of the board meeting, Daniel stayed late, rehearsing his talking points. He'd prepared slides showing improved margins, faster turnaround times, reduced overhead. He believed the numbers would speak for themselves. Leadership wasn't about being liked, he reminded himself. It was about results. Still, as he packed up his briefcase, he caught his reflection in the darkened window. For the first time, doubt flickered in his chest. Had he pushed too hard? Had he mistaken fear for respect? He shook it off. Tomorrow, he'd stand in that boardroom and prove he was the right person for the job. The next morning, the boardroom buzzed with unusual energy. Directors arrived early, some flying in overnight. Lawyers sat at the far end of the table, laptops open, faces unreadable. Daniel took his usual seat at the head, back straight, expression calm. He nodded at each member as they entered, trying to project confidence. Then the video feed activated. A single chair on the screen remained empty for a moment. Then a figure appeared wearing a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, silver hair neatly combed. Calm eyes that seemed to look straight through the camera. Gasps rippled around the room. It was him, the janitor. Daniel froze. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. "Good morning," Arthur said, his voice steady, familiar, but now carrying a weight no one had heard before. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. My name is Arthur Langley. I'm the sole beneficiary and voting representative of the Cedar Hollow Trust, which owns 51.3% of Viridian Holdings' outstanding shares." Silence. One board member leaned forward, squinting. You worked in facilities?" "I did," Arthur said gently. "For 8 months. I wanted to see this company not from a quarterly report, but from its hallways, its break rooms, its late-night shifts. I wanted to know if we still treated people like people." He paused, then added, "I'm afraid the answer was no." He didn't raise his voice, didn't point fingers, but every word landed like a stone in still water. "I was dismissed last week for taking a scheduled break, not for poor performance, not for misconduct, but because I was seen as inconvenient, a distraction from the image of efficiency." Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but Arthur held up a hand, not aggressively, just enough to pause him. "I recorded the encounter," Arthur continued, "not to trap anyone, but because I knew words would be forgotten. Actions wouldn't." He nodded to the legal team. A moment later, the audio played through the room's speakers. Daniel's sharp tone, the cold dismissal, Arthur's quiet reply. The recording ended with the sound of footsteps walking away. No one moved. Arthur looked directly into the camera. This isn't about one moment. It's about what that moment represents. A culture where titles matter more than character. Where speed matters more than care. Where people at the bottom are invisible until they're blamed. He turned his gaze to Daniel. You were hired to lead. But leadership isn't just about cutting costs. It's about building trust. And trust starts with how you treat the person no one is watching. Daniel's face burned. Not with anger, but with something worse. Shame. Around the table, board members exchanged glances. Some looked down. Others nodded slowly. Arthur leaned forward slightly. I didn't call this meeting to fire someone in return. I called it because this company means something to me. Not as an asset. As a community. And communities don't thrive when fear replaces respect. He sat back. So now I leave the next step to you. But know this, I'm not going away. And I'll be watching, not from the shadows, but from the table. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then the chair of the board cleared her throat. We'll recess for 1 hour, she said quietly. Executive session. As the screen went dark, Daniel sat motionless, staring at his hands. For the first time since he'd walked into Viridian as CEO, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small. And somewhere outside, Arthur Langley closed his laptop, poured himself a cup of tea, and waited. Not for revenge, but for change. The boardroom felt heavier after the recess, like the air itself had thickened with unspoken decisions. Outside, rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then steady, tapping against the floor-to-ceiling windows like a quiet reminder that time was moving forward, whether they were ready or not. Inside, Daniel sat alone at the long table, his untouched coffee gone cold. He hadn't moved since the others left. His mind raced, not with excuses but with memories, the way the janitor's eyes had held no anger, only disappointment. The silence of his own team when he'd announced the latest round of cuts. The way people used to linger after meetings to chat, and now they vanished the second the clock hit 5. He'd thought he was being strong, efficient, professional. But now he wondered if he'd just been lonely. Downstairs in a small conference room usually used for vendor calls, Arthur waited. He wasn't nervous. He'd made peace with whatever came next. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. He'd seen too much in his life to believe that shame fixed anything. Real change came from understanding, not punishment. When the board members returned, their expressions were unreadable. The chairwoman took her seat, folded her hands, and looked at Arthur's video feed. Mr. Langley, she began, we've reviewed your concerns, the recording, and Mr. Reeves's recent leadership decisions. We agree that the culture has shifted in ways that no longer reflect Viridian's stated values. She turned to Daniel. You were brought in to stabilize the company financially, and in some areas you've succeeded. But leadership isn't just about numbers. It's about people, and right now our people don't feel seen. Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. For the first time, he just listened. Then Arthur spoke again, his voice calm but firm. I don't believe in throwing people away. I believe in giving them a chance to grow. But growth requires honesty and space. He paused. I'm not asking for you to step down out of spite. I'm asking because the role of CEO demands more than strategy. It demands empathy, and right now that's missing. Daniel swallowed. What happens now? He asked quietly. The chairwoman answered. Effective immediately, you're placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full leadership review. You'll be offered a severance package and outplacement support. This isn't a reflection of your entire career, just of this chapter. Daniel exhaled. It wasn't what he wanted, but it was fair. More than fair, actually. He'd expected worse. Then Arthur did something unexpected. I'd like to meet with you, he said, looking directly at Daniel. Not as owner and employee, just as two men who care about this company, even if we've shown it in different ways. There was a beat of silence. Then Daniel nodded. I'd like that. The meeting ended shortly after. As the board filed out, some offered quiet words of respect to Arthur's feed. Others simply left, heads down, already thinking about how to rebuild what had been lost. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into a small sunlit room on the building's top floor, once used as a meditation space, now mostly empty, Except for 2 chairs and a potted peace lily, Arthur was already there, still in his suit, but without the stiffness of the boardroom. He stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. "You didn't have to do this," Daniel said as he entered. Arthur turned. Maybe not, but someone had to. They sat for a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel said, "I thought I was doing the right thing. Cutting waste. Moving fast. I thought that's what leadership looked like." "It can be," Arthur replied, "but not when it costs you your humanity. Efficiency without compassion is just cold mechanics. And companies aren't machines. They're made of people. People who bring their whole selves to work, whether you see it or not." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I never asked how old you were, or why you were working nights. I just saw uniform. And that's the problem," Arthur said gently. "We've trained ourselves to see roles, not people. The intern, the janitor, the receptionist. We slot them into boxes and forget they have stories, families, dreams." He leaned forward. "I took that job because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be unseen. And I have to tell you, it hurts. Not because the work is hard, but because it makes you feel like you don't matter." Daniel's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," Arthur nodded. "Apology accepted. But don't just say it to me. Say it with your actions, wherever you go next." They talked for nearly an hour. About pressure, about fear of failure, about how easy it is to confuse control with leadership. Arthur didn't offer advice. He just listened. And in that listening, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Seen. Later, as Daniel left the building for the last time, he passed the east hallway where it had all started. The bench was empty. The palm plant had been watered. A new janitor, someone he didn't recognize, was mopping nearby. This time Daniel stopped. "Long shift?" he asked. The man looked up, surprised. "Yeah, but it's okay. Gets quiet after 6, Daniel nodded. "Thanks for keeping this place running." The man smiled, a small, real smile. "Appreciate that. It was a tiny moment. But it mattered." Back in his apartment, Arthur changed out of his suit and into an old sweater. He made tea, sat by the window, and watched the city lights blink on through the rain. He wasn't celebrating. He wasn't angry. He just felt clear. The next morning, he called the board again. Not as a threat, but as a partner. "Let's find a new CEO," he said. Not someone with the flashiest resume. Someone who knows how to listen. And they did. They didn't look outside. They looked inside. There was a woman in operations, mid-level, quiet, but respected by everyone from IT to finance. She'd stayed late during the server crash last winter, bringing coffee to the tech team. She'd advocated for better mental health benefits when no one else would. She remembered birthdays. She asked how people's kids were doing when they offered her the role. She cried. "I never thought." She started, then stopped. "I'll do my best," Arthur smiled. That's all anyone can ask. He didn't take a seat on the board. Didn't demand a title. He simply said, "I'll be around," not as an owner looking down, but as someone who cares. And in the weeks that followed, small changes began to ripple through Viridian. Free snacks returned, not as a perk, but as a symbol. You belong here. Managers started walking the floors, not to inspect, but to connect. The cleaning staff got new uniforms, better hours, and a seat at the monthly culture meetings. Arthur didn't need to be there to see it. He felt it in the tone of the emails, in the laughter echoing down hallways that had once been silent. Because real leadership isn't about power. It's about presence. And sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is the one who chooses to sit quietly on a bench, just to remind everyone that dignity doesn't wear a title. It wears a heart. 6 months after the boardroom meeting that changed everything, Viridian Holdings didn't look wildly different from the outside. The same glass tower still rose above the city skyline. The same logo still glowed softly at night. But step inside and you'd feel it right away. The air was lighter. Conversations flowed more easily. People smiled more. Not the stiff, polite kind, but the real kind. The kind that reaches your eyes. The new CEO hadn't come in with grand announcements or flashy rebranding. She'd started small. She reinstated the break room snacks. Not just chips and cookies, but fruit, granola bars. Even little notes of encouragement taped to the fridge. "You've got this. Thanks for showing up today." She held monthly walk and talk sessions, where she'd wander the floors with no agenda, just listening. And she made one rule clear from day one. If you treat the cleaning crew like they're invisible, you don't belong here. But the biggest change came from something Arthur quietly suggested during their first planning meeting. A program called Ground Level Days. Once a quarter, every leader, from department heads to the CEO herself, would trade their suits for a uniform and spend a full shift doing an entry-level job. Not as a publicity stunt, not for a photo op, just to remember what it felt like to be on the other side of the hierarchy. The first volunteer, the new CEO herself. She spent a Tuesday morning restocking bathrooms, emptying bins, and wiping down elevator buttons. She came back with sore feet and a new perspective. "I never realized how many times people don't say thank you," she told the leadership team the next day. Not because they're rude, just because they don't see you as part of the team. That simple insight sparked a company-wide shift. Signage went up near service areas. "This space is cared for by," with rotating photos and names of the facility's staff. Team meetings began with a moment of recognition, not just for big wins, but for small acts of kindness. Someone who stayed late to help a colleague, someone who brought soup to a sick coworker, someone who held the door. Arthur didn't run any of this. He didn't need to. He'd planted a seed, and now it was growing on its own. He still visited the building occasionally, not in uniform, not in a suit, just as himself. Sometimes he'd stop by the cafe on the ground floor and chat with security guards or delivery drivers. Other times he'd sit in the quiet corner of the lobby and watch people come and go. No one bowed to him. No one even recognized him as the owner. And that was exactly how he liked it. One afternoon he ran into Daniel again, not by accident but by quiet intention. Daniel had taken a role at a smaller firm, one focused on ethical business practices. He looked different, less tense, more present. They met at a park bench near the river, the same kind Arthur used to sit on during his early mornings as a janitor. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Daniel admitted, hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee. "About seeing people, not roles," Arthur nodded. "And I started asking my team how they're really doing. Not just how's the project, but how's your mom's surgery? Or did your kid sleep last night?" "It sounds small, but it changes everything." "That's because it's not small," Arthur said gently. "It's human." They sat in silence for a while, watching a group of kids chase pigeons across the grass. Then Daniel asked, "Do you ever regret showing up that day? Taking the job? It must have been hard being treated like you didn't matter." Arthur smiled. "It was hard, but necessary. You can't fix what you don't understand, and I needed to understand how far we'd drifted." He turned to Daniel. "You weren't a bad person. You were just lost in the noise, and sometimes it takes someone quiet to remind the loud world what really matters." Daniel looked down. "I hope I can be that person for someone else now." "You already are," Arthur said. Back at Viridian, the changes kept coming. Not fast, not flashy, but steady. Turnover dropped by 40%. Employee surveys showed the highest morale scores in a decade. Even clients noticed. "Your team feels happier," one said during a renewal call. "Like they actually care." And they did. Arthur never took credit. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He just kept showing up, sometimes with a thermos of tea, sometimes with a question, always with respect. One Friday, he stopped by the building during lunch. The new CEO saw him from across the lobby and waved him over. "We're starting something new next month," she said, eyes bright. "A mentorship program pairing executives with frontline staff. Not to teach them how to climb, but to learn from them." Arthur's eyes softened. "That's the spirit," she hesitated. "Would you consider being the first mentor?" He thought about it, then nodded. "Only if I can be the mentee too," she laughed. "Deal." As he walked out that day, Arthur passed the east hallway again, the same spot where he'd been dismissed months before. The bench was still there, but now it had a small plaque on the armrest, almost hidden unless you looked closely. It read, "Rest is not laziness. It's part of the work." He touched it lightly, then kept walking. The story of Viridian wasn't about revenge or dramatic comeuppance. It wasn't about one man taking down another. It was about remembering that every person has worth, regardless of their title. That leadership isn't about standing above, but walking beside. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is sit quietly on a bench and give someone the space to breathe. And in a world that often measures success by speed, Noise and status, that kind of quiet courage? That's the rarest kind of all. Arthur disappeared into the afternoon crowd, just another face in the city. But inside the tower behind him, something lasting had taken root. Not because of rules or policies, but because one man chose to see people as people. And in doing so, helped an entire company remember how to be human.